In today's episode, I'll talk about three interesting stories. In the first story, I'll talk about what the governor of the Reserve Bank of India is saying about central banks across the world. In the second story, I'll talk about AI from the lens of the CEO of Anthropic or the popular AI tool Claude. And in the third story, I'll talk about what the WTO is saying about global trade and why it really matters to us. Welcome to the Daily Brief Show by Zerodha, where our aim is to cut through the noise and simplify the biggest financial news for you in a manner that is easy to understand, yet a level deeper as compared to traditional news channels. I'm your host Anurag Bansal, and today is Tuesday, the 15th of October. Shaktikanta Das, the governor of the Reserve Bank of India, recently gave a speech about how central banks are evolving. He focused on three areas: monetary policy, financial stabilities, and new technologies. Now, all of these are key issues for investors like you and me to keep a tab on. So let's break down what he said and why this really matters. First, let's talk about inflation. See, for many years, central banks thought that they had inflation under control. After the high inflation of the 1970s and the 1980s, the following decade saw some stable growth, and the general belief was that inflation would continue to stay low. But that idea did not quite hold up after two major events: the 2008 financial crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic. Both of these crises pushed central banks to take some extreme measures. They had to cut interest rates to near zero and flood the economy with money just to keep things from collapsing. Das pointed out that while these actions were necessary, they have now created some very new problems altogether. Some central banks hold so much debt that it has now started to affect their independence. And this is a big deal because central banks need to be able to make decisions without political interference, and being too tied up in debt could really affect that negatively. But Governor Das said that we in India have handled things a little differently and better. We have had clear dates on our emergency measures, which have helped limit the long-term damage. But even with all of that, rising public debt is still a major issue for central banks around the world. Now, managing this debt is becoming a growing challenge, which is limiting what central banks can do to control inflation or respond to future crises. Mr. Das also touched upon financial stability in his speech, which is another core job of central banks across the world. He explained how during both the 2008 crisis and the COVID-19 pandemic, central banks pumped huge amounts of money into the system in order to keep things afloat. But all of that had a side effect. People and businesses started taking more risk than what they should have because money was so easy and cheap to get. Now, with inflation back, central banks have been forced to raise interest rates very, very quickly. And the moment you start to raise interest rates after a long period of low borrowing costs, problems start to pop up. Some countries have seen banking crisis in 2023 as a result of this, and the bigger issue is that different countries are responding in different ways. Some are tightening their policies while others are loosening them. Now, this creates a lot of uncertainty because absolutely nobody is sure which approach will work the best. In his speech, Governor Das also raised some concerns about the rapid growth of private credit markets, which is some areas of finance that are not quite closely regulated. Now, these markets have grown significantly, and if they hit trouble, it could cause some serious instability because they aren't under the same scrutiny as traditional banks. Finally, Mr. Das talked about technology, which is one of the most interesting areas for central banks right now. See, technology, especially in payments, is transforming the financial world. He used India's UPI as a good example. UPI has made digital payments faster and much more efficient than they were ever before. And Mr. Das believes that this kind of technology would be a game changer for cross-border payments, particularly for remittances. He also mentioned central bank digital currencies or CBDCs, which India is developing. According to Governor Shaktikanta Das, CBDCs have the potential to change how global payments work by making them quicker and more secure. But the thing is, with all of this new technology and excitement, also comes some new risks. Something that Governor Das reminded everyone during his speech is that rumors can spread very, very quickly on social media, which can lead to panic and cause liquidity problems for banks. Another risk is the growing influence of big tech companies. While AI and machine learning offer some new opportunities, there is also a danger that few large companies could gain too much control over financial systems, which could then lead to new vulnerabilities altogether. Mr. Das wrapped up by saying that central banks have done a decent job in managing inflation and preventing major crises so far, but they need to stay on their toes. The challenges ahead are very, very real, but by embracing new technologies and managing risks very, very carefully, central banks can definitely keep economies stable and growing. So, all in all, if I were to summarize, central banks are definitely in a tricky position today. They need to balance inflation control, maintain financial stability, and keep up with fast moving technological developments. How well they manage all of it will very, very significantly shape how the future of global economy looks like. Now, moving on to the next story, I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into the rise of AI, which is something that is shaping out to be a lot more than just a passing trend now. Now, let me clear this up and tell you AI is not at all new. It is something that has existed for many, many years now. But what is different this time around is the pace at which things are changing. And if things continue moving this fast, we'll be looking at some major, major shifts across industries and even in our daily lives. Imagine AI doctors diagnosing diseases with speed and accuracy that has never ever been seen before, or even AI tutors delivering highly personalized education to millions and millions of people across the world, or maybe AI researchers which are solving those problems which have had scientists tearing apart their hairs for many, many decades. There is even talk about AI playing a very key role in tackling massive global challenges like climate change and poverty. Now, I know all of this sounds like science fiction today, but many AI leaders are saying that this future is not at all far from us. And this brings me to the reason why I wanted to discuss this topic today. Dario Amodei, the CEO of Anthropic, which is the company behind the very popular AI platform Claude, recently wrote an essay where he makes some very interesting predictions. Now, the thing is, even if a fraction of his predictions come true, we could soon be living in a world that looks absolutely nothing like what we know of today. In his article, Amodei talks about an optimistic point of view, but he also speaks about the risks. He says that managing risks is the most important task if we were to fully unlock AI's potential as human beings. Without careful development, these powerful systems could become very, very dangerous very, very quickly. And that is why he says that it is very, very critical to prioritize safety before prioritizing anything else. When it comes to healthcare, he suggests that AI could eliminate most cancers, prevent genetic diseases, and even extend human life expectancy potentially to 150 years. He claims that the medical advances we would otherwise expect to see over the next 1 century could be compressed into just 1 decade, all thanks to AI. And it's not just about health. His economic forecasts are super surprising as well. He talks about 20% annual GDP growth in developing countries, which is twice the rate that was seen during the massive Chinese economic boom. According to him, AI could help sub-Sahara Africa reach China's current economic level in just 5 to 10 years. And mind you, that's the kind of transformation which otherwise would take generations happening in the space of a very few years. One of his other ideas is AI running economic policy altogether. Now imagine AI finance ministers and central bankers making decisions more effectively than human experts. I know that sounds very, very far-fetched now, but that's what AI leaders believe. Now that said and done, it is worth taking a small step back and asking whether all of these are just visionary ideas or have we really entered the realm of techno-utopianism. See, if you witness the rise of the internet, you probably know that we've heard of these grand predictions before as well. The internet promised to do a lot more than where we are in reality today. For sure, AI will have a massive impact on the economy, but the idea that it will solve geopolitical challenges, eradicate corruption, or build stronger institutions in just the next few years is a hope we'd not want to probably immediately depend on. By the way, even if all of this does happen, there are major, major risks that we might run into. Amode, in his essay, also addressed some concerns about job displacement and rising inequality. So the question we must ask ourselves is, are we really ready for the society level change that could follow such a rapid technological change? Even though it is very tempting to be inspired by these kind of predictions, we do need to keep sight of real world challenges that will come along with them. What is interesting here is that Amode is not the only one making these claims. Other tech leaders are also hyping up the future of AI. Sam Altman, who's the CEO of OpenAI, has gone far enough to predict super intelligent AI, which is an AI which is smarter than human beings, and that too in just a few thousand days. For your context, that is less than 1 decade away. Then there's also Mustafa Suleiman, who's leading Microsoft's AI projects. He envisions that AI companions will be helping with all aspects of our daily lives, from work to personal well-being as well. But on the flip side, there are also some leaders who are not buying into the AI hype. Yan LeCun, who's Meta's chief AI scientist, recently said in an interview that current AI is dumber than a house cat and that it could be decades before we get to true AI with common sense or human like intelligence. His take is that just throwing more data and computing power at the problem will not solve anything at all. Now, the biggest thing with this is that these predictions are not just about the future, they are also about influencing policymakers, investors, and even the public like you and me. Amodi's essay can be seen as a call for more support and investment in AI. Sam Altman and Suleiman might be positioning their companies as front runners in the race to AGI or artificial general intelligence. Likan's skepticism, on the other hand, could be about managing expectations and keeping meta in the game for a little bit of a longer term. So the question is, who's right? The truth is, no one knows. The reality is that the speed at which AI is developing is surprisingly fast. But the truth is also that we have seen plenty of tech bubbles inflate and burst before. What is clear is that the conversation around AI is just beginning, and we must wait to see how much of the vision actually becomes reality in the near future. With that said, let's move on to the third story and dive into what is happening in global trade right now. There are some latest numbers from the World Trade Organization or the WTO which give us a very solid snapshot of where things stand today and where we might be heading. Why should we care, you might wonder? Look, the simple answer is that trade is not just about countries exchanging goods with each other, it is one of the biggest drivers of economic growth and income levels across the world. The way global trade shifts can have huge impacts on everything like job creation to the cost of living. So, with that established, the question is, what is exactly happening with trade growth in 2024? Look, the WTO recently updated its forecast for merchandise trade and it expects it to grow by 2.7% in 2024. Now, this is a slight improvement from the previous estimate of 2.6%, but it is still very, very modest. Now, I'm sure you might be wondering what is behind this small uptick. The answer isn't regional differences. See, trade in Asia has been stronger than expected, particularly major exporters like China and Vietnam, and that has helped keep global trade afloat. On the other hand, Europe's economic struggles are putting a drag on these numbers. Germany, the continent's manufacturing powerhouse, saw its Purchasing Managers Index or PMI fall to a 12-month low in the month of September. This signals that the country's manufacturing sector is contracting now. So while Asia is boosting global trade, Europe is actually slowing things down. Looking at the bigger picture, we can see that global merchandise trade volumes are up by 2.7% in the first half of 2024. But when you look at the value side, things are nearly flat with just a 0.1% increase. What's going on there, you might be wondering? See, the difference between volume and value tells us that prices for exports and imports have dropped by around 2.6%, which is likely due to weaker demand and changes in supply chains. On the other hand, services are doing a lot better. Trade in commercial services was up 8% year on year in the first quarter of 2024. Travel services in particular surged by 19% as more and more people started traveling again. This bounce back in services is helping offset some of the weaker performance in goods. So while demand for physical products might be a bit softer, people are spending more on services like travel and business related services. The next thing we look at is how different regions are performing and which regions are driving these trends. See, Asia is leading the pack like I expected with expected GDP growth of 4% in 2024. Countries like China and Vietnam are seeing a massive surge in exports, which is helping push this entire region forward. The United States is also doing relatively well with 3% growth in the second quarter of this year, and this is fueled by strong consumer demand. Europe, on the other hand, is a different story. Economic growth is sluggish at just 1.1%, and Germany, in particular, is struggling, like I mentioned before. The country's manufacturing sector continues to decline, and this weakness is weighing on the region's overall performance. It's not just Europe, by the way. Argentina's economy shrank by more than 8% in the first quarter of 2024. And with this, the gap between high performing and struggling regions is becoming more and more noticeable. Now next, let's look at the risks with which these projections come. The WTO highlights several of them, starting with geopolitical tensions. The conflict in the Middle East, for example, could disrupt global shipping lanes, especially in the Red Sea. We've already seen attacks on commercial ships, which are forcing them to reroute around the Cape of Good Hope, which adds time and shipping costs. Energy prices could also spike if the situation escalates, which creates further uncertainty. Another risk is the growing fragmentation in global trade. Countries are increasingly aligning their supply chains based on political alliances. This has been particularly evident since the war in Ukraine, and it is creating a more divided trade landscape. But between all of these challenges, there are some countries which are finding new opportunities. Countries like Vietnam and Mexico are stepping up as critical links in the global supply chain. As companies try and reduce their reliance on China, these very countries are benefiting quite a lot. Mexico, for example, saw its exports to the US grow by over 9% in the first half of 2024. Its proximity to the United States, combined with its integration into North American trade networks, makes it a very, very attractive option for businesses that are looking to diversify. Similarly, Vietnam's exports have surged 16% during the same time period as companies have shifted supply chains to avoid over reliance on one country. Both Mexico as well as Vietnam are becoming key players in the evolving global landscape. By the way, this year also marks the 30th anniversary of the WTO, which emerged from the Marrakesh Agreement in 1994. One of the big goals of that agreement was to ensure that developing economies could secure a fair share of global trade. The question is, how has that played out across the last 3 decades? See, the progress has been pretty significant. See, since 1995, income levels in low and middle income countries have nearly tripled, and global per capita income has grown about 65%. The share of people living below poverty line in these very economies have dropped from 40% in 1995 to just 11% today. In terms of trade, these economies have doubled their share of global exports from about 16% to 32%. We've also seen trade costs drop by 8% globally between 1995 and 2020. Trade between low and middle income economies has also soared. It has grown from 5% of global trade in 1995 to nearly 20% in 2022. At the same time, trade between high income economies has declined over half of global trade from 1995 to just 32% by 2022. So, the last 30 years have shown us how powerful trade can be in driving economic growth and reducing poverty. But the road ahead is pretty uncertain. With rising geopolitical tensions and the risk of trade fragmentation, maintaining the gains of the past few decades could really become challenging. Countries that can adapt to these changes, like Vietnam and Mexico, may find themselves in stronger positions as global trade evolves. But as always, global economy is very, very unpredictable. How well countries navigate these very challenges will very well determine the future of international trade. That brings us to the end of this story. Now let's move on to the final section of the day, which is a small tidbits. First, Reliance Industries is in talks to acquire a share in Dharma Production, which expands its media presence. Now, this move could really improve Reliance's content portfolio, which could enhance its dominance in India's entertainment sector. Second, India has become the second largest supplier of restricted technologies to Russia, with exports exceeding 95 million US dollars in July 2024. Now, this poses a challenge for Western sanction efforts as India balances its relationship with both Russia and the West. Third, India and Sri Lanka are finalizing a 5 billion US dollar road project which connects Tamil Nadu to Sri Lanka. This will enhance trade, tourism, and investment. The project counters Chinese influence and strengthens regional connectivity. Fourth, Noel Tata has been appointed as the chairman of Tata Trusts. His leadership is expected to steer Tata Sons through challenges in AI, semiconductors, and TCS revitalization alongside Tata Sons chairman N. Chandrasekhan. Fifth and the final one, SpaceX successfully launched its fifth Starship test flight, advancing reusable space travel and moving closer to Elon Musk's vision for Mars colonization. This milestone is also very, very key for NASA's Artemis program. Disclaimer: this content is for informational purposes only. None of the stocks, brands, or products mentioned are recommendations or endorsements.